And I'd like to thank everyone for persisting to listen to our final panel of the day. Hope everyone's enjoyed all the other sessions as much as I have, and great to see you all here today. I'm going to intro our panel, starting with Elena. So Elena is the head of share schemes at Aviva, with responsibility for all of the Aviva share plans globally, and we'll come to how many and varied they are in a minute. Elena joined Aviva in 2013 from UBS. Elena also runs SPUG, Share Plan User Group, a community for share plan professionals and issuers, and also serves as a member of the ProShare Advisory Panel. Coming to Ian next. Ian is a partner at Corn Ferry, where he advises public and private companies on share-based incentive plans. He's got nearly 20 years' experience advising companies through IPOs, funding rounds, and M&A activity. Ian joined Corn Ferry from Oric, Harrington and Sutcliffe, where he was a partner. And finally on to Mark. Mark was formerly General Counsel at Abcam, a leading biotech company, between 2020 and 2024, and took the company from a London listing onto the NASDAQ in 2022. So again, quite topical, and we're going to come to what that means in a second. So jumping on to our first question, I think Armin opened the session nicely with his summary, so I'm not going to go over that again, so I'm going to go straight to our first question. And the first question is around a comprehensive remuneration strategy, kind of what that means. So this would be decided well before IPO, in a case of a company that's about to list, or after IPO, in PLC life, as we're calling it. But I want to know really from, and I'm going to start with Ian. When we talk about benchmarks and comparables and how we track these things, how can senior leadership use equity to attract and retain talent in PLC life?
I mean, I think your starting point is a rigorous job evaluation system using something like the Hay Group method, which is what Corn Ferry used. Other remuneration consultants are available. That really looks at job sizes rather than titles, which can mean different things to different people. And I think especially with the advent of the pay transparency legislation sweeping throughout Europe at the moment, that also is more likely to protect, of course, against legal claims. So there'll just be much more transparency over your pay. I think it is difficult to retain people who've made a lot of money on a one-off capital event, and it's going to be difficult to replicate that large one-off public payment in a public company plan. I think what's already been mentioned, sort of holding periods, and a sort of nuance to that, sort of 10, 15 years ago, the holding periods I used to see were sort of 2 years, you can't sell anything, and then you can sell up to 2 years. I think there's a bit more nuance there that we've seen recently. There's a sort of 25% after 6 months, perhaps 50% after a year, and so on. And of course, that doesn't stop you leaving the company. You don't necessarily lose those shares if you leave, because you've already sort of earned those, if you like. But it does retain senior leadership because they want to have responsibility over the company operationally and ensure its share price stays where they want it to and increases because it ties their paper wealth obviously to the success of the company. I think there's a real mindset shift between having either no performance conditions, and I'd probably say with startup options, which we've done hundreds at Oric, probably 20 or 30% had performance conditions, and where they did, there were things like private company metrics like EBITDA, or perhaps sort of operational metrics like getting this particular project done. There's a real shift over to things like total shareholder return, EPS, and ESG metrics, and it's crucial to have a good remuneration consultant there who understands that and who talks to the proxy agencies. They're also thinking of equity rather in terms of sort of percentage terms, like say a CEO package might be say 1% of your equity is as a startup. That equates to say 10 million payout on a £1 billion exit. To moving over to sort of say a CEO in a small cap FTSE might get 100% of salary, but that will be an award which vests over 3 years. So once the scheme's been going for a while, you've got in-flight awards, so 1/3 vested, 2/3 vested, and a payout every year. And perhaps for, say, a larger FTSE 250, you might say something like 50% of salary. So I think that's important to recognise that you're not going to replicate that sort of one-off quantum. And I think it's critical really to just liaise with somebody who's got a good knowledge of proxy agencies, because if you write your remuneration policy, which you have to do as a public company, in a particular way, it will get through investors. if you write it in a legally correct way, it won't necessarily. There's a way of expressing things which gets you sort of looped up, and there's a way of expressing it that gets you rectified. They may not actually legally be particularly different, but there's certain nuances of really how you express things and something again like something.
And Mark, can you comment on that question as well from your experience?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because at ABCAM you talked about the move from a small cap percentage of equity to percentage of salary. Actually at ABCAM what we did is, and I'll come to it a bit later, but we did introduce a scheme that remunerated our CEO, CFO and some senior leaders based on a percentage of share capital, which is very unusual for a company of our size at that time. We were top 5 in AIM and then listed on NASDAQ. So it's really, you really have to think about what you're trying to achieve. There were reasons for doing that. I think pick up another point that Ian made is actually that came about as a retention piece. Prior to the scheme I've just described, we had another scheme that was similarly generous, but not quite as far-reaching, and that had come to an end. It's like, okay, and that was an all-employee scheme. That's coming to an end. How do you make sure people stay? Well, then you have to come up with something that's even more incentivising to stay. We never got to the next stage because we got acquired, but you have to be careful of not constantly trying to one-up yourself each time. And we had issues with the proxy agencies, as Ian alluded to. I think that what we had is moving from AIM to NASDAQ. That also changed the coverage for the proxy agencies. So we went from a UK perspective for the first time we got a plan through to then the US ones, and all of a sudden it was a very, very different approach that we found. It didn't change our shareholder base. We still had to manage the UK and European shareholders' views against the US ones, but it was a case of making, suddenly we were having had we sort of a battle with the proxy agencies to get their support. All of a sudden then we kind of going, there's nothing to see here, this is fairly standard for the US, which had not been the case previously.
I think just to add to that, maybe the slightly unpopular opinion on all of this is as much planning as you do in terms of design, and oh God, it is required. The reality is, and this is coming from the mindset of very established PLC, 330-year-old company, offering plans since 1930, so we've been there a really long time. The last 6 years, all I've done is work on divestments and acquisitions, and you've seen the mindset shift, and the reality is there is such an overwhelming mindset shift of individuals, personality types coming from the smaller organisation to this beast, if you like, and no matter what that retention looks like, it's just not fit for that kind of personality type. So yeah, that's a difficult one to get over.
It certainly sounds like it. And that brings me nicely onto the next question I have, and I'm going to give a little bit of a background here in terms of the companies that Mark in AdCam and Alan at Aviva. So we mentioned the kind of move from AIM to NASDAQ in 2022, Mark. And funnily enough, the exact kind of opposite happened with Aviva, where you were dual listed and you were listed on the US exchange and then moved away from that and now solely listed in the UK. And we hear a lot about, particularly around CEOs and the CEO pay and how that gets looked at, the lens that's looked at in the US, where we're used to hearing they just pay what it takes. The CEO pay it's huge over there, and there's a kind of a different cultural take on it, let's say in Europe. And coming to Mark first on that, what's your experience around that, and obviously with the context of your move and your listing?
Yeah, and it's interesting because our CEO at ABCAM was actually a US national. He lived in the UK for 20 years, but was a US national. And there was always this fear hanging over the board. He was, he transformed ABCAM in his time there. This fear that he could be poached by a US competitor, and it really was the US competitors that we were competing with. We've got the benchmark data, and it's very European versus US approach. On salary, be about the same, and then suddenly when the equity piece was factored in, he's bottom 10% easily. So then that's why we then introduced this new share incentive plan to try and make sure he had some skin in the game, really skin in the game, to make sure he hung around and we could retain him. What we found though is with our move, so we were on AIM, We actually listed on NASDAQ in 2020, were dual listed for a couple of years and then delisted in 2022 to become sole NASDAQ listed. What we found is with the old share scheme running out, we wanted to get a new share scheme in place to retain the CEO. We put that in place before we listed on NASDAQ. We were aimed, we didn't have to have shareholder vote, but we followed the corporate governance code. We had shareholder vote because we had this split in our US, UK shareholders. It just snuck through. More than 40% voted against. So got it through, big sigh of relief. We then listed on NASDAQ. Then there's a technical part of the Companies Act that says once you've voted, you need to have a binding shareholder vote on your remuneration plans. So all of a sudden, you have to go to the board and say, actually, I know we've just been through this quite gruesome process. We've got to go through it again to be listed on NASDAQ. And we always knew this was the plan, but people don't pay attention to these things when they're going. There's lots of other things going on. So then all of a sudden, we had to go through the whole process again. And more votes in favour, still not quite as many as the board would have liked. But it's it's really thinking about being aware that if you're putting share plans in place or changing them with a view to an IPO, really taking into account what that's going to mean post-IPO, how it's going to operate, how your shareholder base is going to change as well. So if you are IPOing and your shareholder base is changing from private equity or private shareholders to a public market shareholders, who are they going to be? Would they support what you're trying to do? Do you want to make sure that shares are vested and awards are granted well in advance of IPO so you don't have to go through this approval process again with the risk that it gets voted down and you then have the nightmare transaction turning around to your CEO, CFO, C-suite saying, you thought you were going to get these shares, actually shareholders have decided they don't like it anymore, so you're not. That's not a conversation we had to have, but it's a conversation we had to plan for, which is never something that you really want to have to think about, is something someone can get their money in.
Thank you. Eleanor, would you like to comment on that one as well?
Look, the dual listing thing is something that, depending on your whereabouts of your organisation, at one point, like you said, we were dual listed, we were on the New York Stock Exchange, but we divested from the US, and then for a few years after, we were still dual listed. So you've kind of got this double reporting and double everything that you need to consider. And at one point, you just go, well, it's not right for us anymore. And these things happen in cycles, so who knows, never say never. I'm not giving any information because I don't know what the plan is, but you just never know. It does go in cycles.
I wasn't going to address that, but the dual listing point is interesting, but with the changes to the listing rules, which came recently, if your sort of secondary listing, if you like, is in the commercial companies equity share sector, then you're complying with the UK corporate governance, which of course explain. But if you are in the secondary listing for overseas companies, then you don't. That's sort of like the old sort of standard listing. I think in the UK, we recently saw Hunting, who are FTSE 250, get approval for a hybrid plan. So it's not just quantum. Quantum's obviously a massive piece, but hybrid plans where basically you've got part of the award vesting, like what restricted share awards, if you were just there for say 3 years, and the other part subject to typically, say, UPS, TSR, whatever performance conditions. Historically, the UK proxy agencies haven't liked that because that's seen as sort of hedging your bets a little bit. But Hunting certainly played the US competitiveness card, and I said, look, 70% of our revenue is from the US. And interestingly, Glass Lewis were supportive of that, but ISS weren't because there wasn't really so much of a discount which they would expect for moving to a plan in which there's increased certainty of vesting. And just noting subtle, but I think shows a direction of travel point in the Investor Association Principles of Remuneration, which came out about 48 hours ago. That for those of you who haven't walked through it, is they used to say we would expect at least a 50% discount if you're moving from performance shares to restricted shares, and that's at least 50%. That's actually changed to typically 50%. So I think that shows a sort of a bit of a softening there, and also that the 5% dilution limit actually for discretionary share plans seems to have disappeared, and the 10% limit for all your share plans is still there. But if you're a high growth company, they actually now explicitly state we might let you have a higher limit. So that's interesting if you're a scale up who is coming to market. I think things are softening.
just to pick up one point that Ian made there, which it might not be obvious if you haven't IPO'd and you're not used to dealing with proxy agencies, but there can be a level of arbitrage between them because they don't always go the same way. You can get a sense as to who's going to go which way. So if you're designing a plan and you think it might be tricky, you can find out from your shareholders whether they follow ISS, whether they follow Glass Lewis, or whether they don't follow either, or they use them for guidance. And therefore, if you have a significant proportion of your shareholder base that follows one of them, design your plan and you can get a yes from them. And perhaps if it means losing the other, that might be a risk you want to take.
Very interesting, thank you. Moving on to the next question. So what we're going to talk about now is large global organizations and kind of the approach when you've got multiple plans. So we've heard about Legi's recent survey of listed businesses. So I'm going to delve into that a little bit here. So the survey was, there was over 1,000 people surveyed here, and what we've seen is a significant minority of these global businesses run more than 5 plants concurrently. And I'm looking particularly at here when I talk about that. So when you're dealing with like a matrix set of share plans, and what are the golden rules when it comes to maintaining compliance and still engaging the participants?
Oh, where do I start? Have we got longer than the time? Because let me just start by kind of painting a picture as to where we are as an organisation. Our team is a team of 3. We've got 10 sets of plan rules. We've got 17 different plan types from about 17 countries. And my title should have changed over the years because it's head of share schemes, but I've got cash, I've got funds, everything kind of falls under my remit. So maybe I should just be head of incentive schemes or something. But that picture really broadens out. We've got 26,000 participants over all of the schemes. So immediately you kind of go, okay, team of 3, how does that work? And so for us, and I'm going to use the word partner very, very strongly, is you have to partner with a very strong administrator who you are truly partners with. You have to partner with a law firm and a tax advisor and a comms agency or an internal comms team or whatever it is, because the reality is you cannot do it all yourself. So you need to really partner, because each of these facets are an extension of your team, and that's a realisation you have to come to. And I think we've kind of seen a lot of it through a lot of the acquisitions that we've made over the years, where we have acquired these smaller businesses that have, for want of a better word, been managing these schemes on the back of a fact packet, or Excel, let's call it Excel. But it's kind of bringing them in, bringing the governance to surround these schemes that they've created. I mean, we've a live example at the moment. One of the companies that we acquired a couple of years ago, they are still running, they're part of the Aviva group, they are still running independently though, but it's the first time in 2 years that they have a good leaver. So they're asking us as a group centre, how do you deal with it? So we kind of go back to the rules, and there is this element of good leaver in their so-called rules, 2 pages of something, but it doesn't actually say what will actually happen, what does good leaver mean? So the concept is there, but the action isn't. So, we're advising them as a group, given the recommendation of, some LTIP type plan, let's prorate it, blah, blah, blah. It's that kind of conversation that you have to have. So, in the situation like Aviva, where we have had so many acquisitions, it is kind of bringing it all into the centre for control somewhat, but it does create that governance and make sure that, that back and fan packet stuff that used to happen isn't happening, and we won't ultimately get in any major trouble. So there's a lot there that you need to really consider.
Absolutely. I think that's worth picking up, obviously, on due diligence as well. Certainly, I've had firms say, we can't afford to document it properly, we'll just work it off the slide. And that's all very nice until it isn't. And that cheap legal advice or no legal advice can be one of the most expensive things you can buy. And I think similarly on the share plan admin front. We've had firms who don't just run it off Excel, we can't afford it. They're not realising that it's actually pretty cheap these days because you're sort of making an investment in them in order to get a bigger client once you go to IPO. And we certainly have had a real life example of where I think it was a Series D, it started to get quite valuable, and the Excel spreadsheet added up to 105%.
Yeah, so just to build on that as well, I think, as we said, it's a problem. It's not a problem until it's a problem. So AppCam's public life ended when we were acquired, and going through the acquisition with multiple share plans, some of them going back, the tail was running 15 years, having to deal with the admin of finding former employees or current employees participating in multiple share plans, tidying all that up, and in a way that can be dealt with simply and easily understood. I think picking up on one of the points earlier is communicating multiple options to multiple people. No one has quite the same selection of plans, so you can't just do one email. And if you do several emails to one person, and then somebody sits next to me, hang on, they got 4 emails, I only got 2, what's going on there? And it just makes all of the admin so much more, and your life becomes like the AI chatbot that Stephanie showed earlier. All you're doing is how to exercise, print off the form, sign it, scan it back. So between printing the form, print off the form. It's simpler you can make things, as simpler you can have things administered, easier, and then as you get the older share plans, multiple share plans, it just gets exponentially more difficult each one you add on top.
We've actually been asked to write operating guides, which for people in HR, because if you left your role and didn't hand over, the next person that would be pretty difficult gig. So we've done that, and also put in things like the exercise of discretion and how to do that fairly, which just tries to ensure that you're not exposed to somebody.
But I think the one thing that we haven't really touched on is participant experience. And when we do look at, again, using Aviva as an example with all the acquisitions that we've made, we have got all these subsidiaries operating independently. And with that, it means they've got, potentially their own payrolls, their own set of, pensions, their own benefits selection, and the only thread that goes through all of these schemes and their only link to the group are these share plans, funds, whatever it is. And if that participant experience isn't there, whether it's through the administration or the communications, they will never get that kind of feeling that they're part of this bigger thing, because they are working independently for their, we've got huge amount of workshops for our general insurance business, Solus, who go in and they fix all the cars where there's been accidents. They don't really consider on their day-to-day that they work for ultimately Aviva. They are Solus, and their only thread and link to the bigger beast are the share plans. And that is why it is one of the most important threads in that participant experience. The other thing is, with the smaller subsidiaries, they would get a letter at the point of entry into these things and then never hear about it again until maybe invested or not. But at least if there's something on an admin side, they can go in, they can engage with it, they can see what is the value, what does my portfolio look like, what do I walk away from if I decided to walk away? If it's in a drawer, in a piece of paper in a drawer, they'll never be able to see that easily. So, very important.
You can set culture really, can't you? Like if you want to sort of one Aviva culture, like it sounds like you've got, you do that. Equally, I've had other firms where they've said actually some of our overseas offices and some of our business lines do vastly better than others. And those who perhaps don't work as hard are actually perfectly happy that other offices earn more. So we've actually sometimes done profit share plans based on metrics for the individual office.
But sometimes the C-suite forget what that one Aviva piece looks like. So, a few years ago when we gave the free share award to all employees following a return of capital to shareholders, I got the go-ahead, we're doing a free share award to all employees, £1,000. I was like, fantastic. What do you mean by all employees? They were like, well, UK, Canada and Ireland, our core markets. I went, they're not our only employees. What do you mean, Eleanor? I was like, well, we've got all these subsidiaries, we've got all these countries that aren't our core 3 markets. but they are our colleagues, they're our employees. So again, what do you mean by all employees? And let's revisit this conversation. And yeah, I got my way, obviously, and we granted truly to all employees. And it was massive to so many people that would have never seen anything like that before. So yeah, it is a true thread that goes through the whole organisation.
And that's 30 sets of securities laws advice, 30 sets of financial promotion.
I mean, it wasn't fun or easy, but you know.
That's exactly what I mean by partnering with a good law firm that perhaps do you a bit of a favour on that.
I think it's interesting as well. We've workshopped a new title for Elna, Head of Everything.
I'll take it.
We'll survey at the end. Okay, moving on. I think this kind of fits nicely with the journey we've seen throughout the day, and the question is about in a private context, companies control which investors buy shares, who takes up the seats on the board, but public companies have a completely different set of challenges. And in particular, I'm going to talk about activist investors here. I'm looking at you first, Mark, from this perspective. I'm going to let you answer the question, but the question essentially is, what happens when there's an activist investor in a public company?
Yeah, so we, ABCAM, had quite a public debate with what an activist investor happened to be our founder, who had been the CEO, then became deputy chair, then became just an investor, and then decided early last year to become an activist. What was interesting about that, I think what's relevant here is we had this ambitious share plan, which he had been on the board when it was starting to be designed. As a shareholder, he had supported. Then suddenly as an activist, he decided he didn't like it. It was focused on all the wrong things. It was going to overly remunerate the CEO who he had personally chosen and hired, and led to, this is all in the public documents, because when you have an activist, particularly in the US, there's a lot of public discourse. It then came from this guy who was being one of the main supporters, he was a 10% shareholder, to somebody saying, no, this is terrible, I don't know why this was ever put in place. And we kind of had to go, well, you were there when we were discussing it, you were part of it. So what we really found is it was ambitious. It didn't have 100% shareholder support, as I mentioned. It was over 50%, but not hugely over 50. And what it really became was a stick that he could beat us with. He would ignore the fact that he had been supported, and suddenly it's going, look, you've set this really ambitious target. You have set, this is going to be a large payout for the CEO, CFO, senior leaders. He kind of was conflating, ignoring the fact that it was an ambitious target, and just sort of jumping to that. This is going to result in lots of money for the CEO. And you're then having to get into the detail when perhaps you want to have to re-bring this up again, saying, yes, it could be a large payout, only if we had doubled our revenue in 5 years, which was effectively one of the targets, which was very, very tough. We'll only be paying out exceptional amounts in exceptional circumstances. So again, it's the sort of thing you don't, with a share plan, be ambitious, we would really try to push the boundaries of what we can get away with. Unfortunately, that then came back, and we then had to have the same arguments ultimately 3 times. Once when we first put in shareholders, the second time we put in shareholders, and then thirdly, once this activist came out, and we had to again go through all of these arguments, and you're talking to the same shareholders each time. And some would go, heard it once, fine, we didn't like it, it got through, and that's it. But some would try and have the same arguments or same debates time and time again. Can you change your share plan? You're not going to change it now, because if you try and change it, you then have claims and everyone is going to benefit because you're saying we're taking something away. As it was also interestingly, it wasn't an employee share plan, but we had a secondary plan which largely mirrored it, which is slightly easier to achieve for all employees. So actually the targets that were hit would affect all employees. If we change that again to have something every employee, and guess what? This shareholder doesn't like it, we've rewritten the whole thing, and it's just something that we wanted to avoid. Ultimately, we had to have the debate, but in the end, we won the argument to extend the sale process before. But it's if you're designing a share plan, you have to think about not just when you put it in place, what can it mean going forward? What if you don't hit the target? What if you do hit the target? Is it too generous? Who do you think is too generous? Who do you think is not generous enough? It doesn't stop just because you've got a share plan in place. It's not the end of it. It's not just, hey, we've done it, let's sit there for 3 years and get that cash. It's what could happen.
And I was just going to say, one of the things that was sort of top of the list sort of a couple of years ago, coming out of COVID, where perhaps share prices and what we were saying, talking about a percentage of salary, rather than percentage of equity. During COVID, some grants when the share price was sort of on the floor, as you came out of recovery in 3 years' time, were really rather large. So there was a concept of what's called windfall gains. And certainly, if you didn't have the ability to adjust downwards to something sort of sensible, you got the sort of issue where you got Jeff Furbo getting about 130 million, which was largely due, some to his own genius, I'm sure, but largely due to the fact that the government had had the Help to Buy scheme. So it's things like that.
We had exactly, and this share scheme was nothing for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, if you hit the target, it paid out in full. So you have to put the number for the last year as if it paid out in full, ignoring the fact that it was actually over 5 years that the people who participated didn't get any share awards. So we would look at it and say, well, if you analyse it over 5 years, it's this much. But then public documents, you have to say, but really in 1 year, it would be this much. And suddenly you've got an activist saying, this guy's going to earn however many tens, hundreds of millions. Yes, but he's taking on by nothing, but he's not having a share award for the 5 years leading up to it. And it really is difficult to think about what you have to report and how that can be interpreted by people who are in favour and also people who are against.
I actually had a look the other day as part of something that a survey that we were doing about, I think on the London market, about 80% of companies had performance shares. I think it was about 13% had restricted shares, and it was about 2% had value creation plans.
Yeah, we won.
And just a quick follow-up, Mark, on that, because it triggered something for me. You mentioned, because you were listed in the US, or you moved the listing to the US, that was there an impact of that move on dealing with the activist investor in the form of
Yes, because we fell into, because we were NASDAQ, we fell into the US activist investor rules, where to be an activist in the US you have to file a form saying, by the way, I'm going to be an activist. So we've been having discussions with the founder, and we knew he had some concerns about the way the business, and then we get notifications saying, this has been filed with the SEC, such and such is now an activist, and then everyone sees that, and all of a sudden you go, well, what's your founder saying I'm an activist? And it makes it much more public, much more, you can't deal with it in-house anymore, you have to deal with it publicly whether you wanted to.
And would you like to come in on this kind of point around what you've seen with Aviva?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's, I wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that have been raised around kind of it doesn't stop at designing a plan and then on the COVID piece. So it absolutely doesn't stop at designing a plan. Like I mentioned before, we had our archive list look into how long we've been doing this for, and 1930 is the first evidence that we found of offering some sort of employee share ownership. So employee share ownership is hugely important to us as an organisation. 80% of our colleagues are shareholders. We own as a collective 2% of the issued share capital, which puts us in the top 10. I think when I last looked at it, we were number 8. So it's huge. So, if you do need to consider activism, then, if you have got full engagement by your workforce, you can make a little dent in the number for sure. But, the way we think about things as well is it's not just about getting people in. We do statistics around all sorts of metrics, be it age, gender, all the D&I characteristics, to see where is it that we're not appealing to people, and where can we kind of go into our communities and say, hey, this is for everyone, let us know what the questions are, let us know how we can help you. The amount of, you need to think about Aviva, most of our colleagues, our call centre agents, don't earn a huge amount of money. The amount of those colleagues, however, that have spoken to me about their SAYE house, as an example, is amazing. And you kind of say, you stand back and you go, okay, all this discretionary stuff, it's great, but you're kind of backed into a corner and you have to do what you have to do. It's the all-employee stuff that actually is super important and is why I do my job, which then puts you into a COVID situation. People doubled their money last year, SAYE, then all of a sudden you've got a whole set of other obligations towards your colleagues, which is you know, these people have got CGT to sort out. It's not something that I had one of our colleagues get in touch with me to tell me that they are an SAYE participant. CGT was not designed to capture him specifically, and I was doing it all wrong. And I was like, well, I might want to go and speak to HMRC about that one, because I'm not sure I'm doing it all wrong. And it was set to design to capture rich people and not him. And this is someone who was contributing £500 a month in their SAYE. So, you know, but then it kind of raises that whole piece around the obligation that you've then got, or the responsibility, shall I say, because then all these colleagues do turn to you to kind of go, well, what do I do here? I didn't know about CGT, I didn't know how to pay this. And resonated the conversation, the keynote at the beginning, who kind of said, well, how many people pay CGT? When you think about how many colleagues we have in all of our organisations, it doesn't quite add up.
Just on that CGT point, one of the privileges of being deputy chair of the tax working group of the Quoted Companies Alliance is that you get to spend your weekend writing part of their budget submissions. And what we said this time, as well as some sort of tinkering around the edges of EMI, CSOP and SIP, just basically trying to increase the limits and decrease the holding periods because people don't stick around as long, is really having a concept of employee gains, a sort of earned gains. And so one of the constellations is we did get quoted in City AM, and what we basically said was that if you've sold shares in your employer or the employer's group, there ought to be a special rate for you. Perhaps the 20% it is at the moment, or I think the keynote speaker, I'm a little bit more optimistic. So often when we've got something in advance of the budget that says it's going to be hell and high water, that just sort of preps everyone, and then if it comes out at 35%. And remember, of course, there's no NICs with CGT, so there is still a delta. Everyone will probably consider that probably a win. And we've got a special rate for, say, carried interest, so I can see that going up from sort of 28 to sort of 35 or something, and that being a sort of earned gains concept. So I think we will still get something like that, and yes, we did cast it wide enough to catch things like growth shares and other things that the revenue don't like as much. Nice.
Okay, I think I'm curious to see how many questions we have, so I'm going to leave quite a bit of time for questions. And open to the floor, so we might have a few. Do we have any questions?